Okay, we are live, and this is the Creely Blades podcast. We have not done one of these for a little while, and so we are trying a little different route. So this is a live stream, and we should be live on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. So
Okay.
we will see. So today's topic is lots of fun. We're going to talk about uh, some knife terms that get used a lot that have virtually zero meaning. And so we're going to try to give them some meaning, hopefully, maybe, and talk about them a little bit, get into it a little bit, talk about some of the companies a little bit that are out there. So, without further ado, let's start out with a pocket check. So we'll start out with Doug because he is looking prepared for a pocket check.
Well, true to form, I only had 2 items on me all day.
Okay.
So that is, I'm going to position them here. This is so unusual for me, but this is all I had on me today. So this is a Chapman Preferred custom neck knife.
Yes, it is.
With the crimson Cerakote and 1095 steel and a Spyderco Nissinger. I can't pronounce that properly. That is my keychain always. So super light carry for me. If I had been leaving the property, it would have been a different story. But this is tried and true what it is.
All right.
Yeah, I think you had 25 on you on Saturday.
Oh, easily. Yep.
Yeah, I was impressed.
Well, on a normal day, I would have more than 2 options. But since I did not leave the property, that is what it is. I have some fun visual aids for later, but they were not truly part of the EDC today.
Gotcha.
All right. What do you have, Paul?
I got a couple on me. My kind of always with me is a leather and rebar. I don't really use the blade on this very much, but I like that. And I think I might actually be carrying the same knife as when we did our last one. I'm carrying my Maximet Native 5 lightweight. And I don't know how well the camera's picking this up. We've got a little bit of, I don't know if I'd call that patina, but discoloration.
Looks like it's a little, climbed up the edge there a little bit.
A little streaky. Yeah, I laid it back to 15 because everybody said Maximet's chippy, and I was like, let's see what happens. And I have had no ill effects.
So we had it. Yep. Go ahead.
No, that's. Yeah. I'm very happy with Maximet. It's you get these people posting that a certain knife steel, chips too easily or is impossible to sharpen, and that just hasn't been my experience. I've been very happy with it. I wanted to see how much abuse it would take without chipping, and if I was really going to have any issues with a non-stainless blade. As much as I think it's cool to have like LC200N or Magna Cut that will never rust. Really, Magna Cut or Maximet does it for me. So, yeah.
So what I carried today was my latest acquisition. I was at a knife show, and I only bought one knife. Did I only buy one knife? I only bought one knife. I bought some other things, but I only bought one knife. And that is actually, I don't know the name. Maybe you guys, it's not the Malibu. This is a Protec. This is a manual Protec. Name of the model, though. Deep carry clip. That's the milling of the scales. Scaly scales, I would say. Coated blade, which isn't my favorite, but I really like their blue anodized aluminum. And it's got really good action. That's pretty nice. It has a thumb deployment clip also, which is obviously a new thing for. Well, I don't know how new it is, but it's certainly not a common thing for Protec. So I'm really psyched about that. I'll carry this for a while. I got lots of things here. Here's an interesting knife. Here's a Freeman. And he does this interesting. Let's get closer to the camera. They say I put the name of the steel on the blade big. I'm no match for that. He does that huge step over on the milling of the primary bevel, and then the second, the secondary bevel, the sharpened edge, ends up being almost like a Scandi because probably it was left pretty thick behind the edge. This is a really cool knife, though. This is a smaller maker like me. That says Freeman. There's like a mirror effect on the camera, and it's like barely focusing, but you get the sense. Aluminum scales. At the time, this is a push button also, and it's a pretty significant blade, but it's a flipper deployment, or it has the little milled out, like a Spidey hole type deal. Generally, with most of my push buttons, they're just a flip. Wow. Like so. I didn't carry that today, but it was just sitting here, so I thought that'd be fun. Let's get to our topic. So I was listening to a podcast. Actually, it was a new podcast. I don't even remember what the name of the podcast. And they talked about what is a custom knife. And the guys on this particular podcast sounded like a couple of them were older guys, like that were in the custom knife world for a really long time. And so they gave their opinions on this particular topic, which were a little bit different than mine. So, or at least in my mind. So the first question I want to ask and answer is, what is a custom knife? What is a custom knife? What makes for a custom knife? I'll answer first, and then I'll defer to you guys and see whether you agree or disagree. First thing is, I think the definition of a custom knife has changed over the years. I think initially a custom knife was, I drew you a picture of a shape or a model, or I set a drop point or a Bowie or whatever it was, and then I told you what steel I wanted, I told you what handle materials I wanted, I told you what kind of grind I wanted, and then you took that order and made that knife custom, completely custom. And I think that's how it went for a while. I think even back then, guys would have a few patterns that they did. And even as a custom knife, I think sometimes those patterns would be like, okay, here's my drop point, here's my this, here's my that, here's my 4 base models, which one do you want? And they might have customized from there a little bit, say, hey, could you do this one, but could you give it a choil or something like this? So that's what custom knives were. But slowly but surely, it becomes much more efficient to make a batch of like 4 or 5 of the same knife. And so custom knives, I think in today's nomenclature, custom knives just mean knives that are handmade in a guy's shop. Custom knives. My definition of custom knives, it might be a little generous. As far as I'm concerned, if you have ground the bevel of the knife, if you've ground it, whether with a jig or by hand or free-handed or forged out or however it is you made it, if you did that then I think that's your custom knife. In the early days, I remember in the Knife Makers Guild, I think it was. Oh, was it the Knife Maker? What's the? There's the ABS, and then there was the
Guild.
it was a guild. Yeah. So if you water jetted, that didn't count as custom at one point. So, which is crazy to me, because I'll water jet if I just want one. Oh, actually, laser, more like it. So, what do you guys think about that definition? Is that what you think, or am I all washed up?
I think that the way you're describing custom, the way it used to be described, honestly, to me, a more accurate descriptor now might be handmade, right? So, like, just for the sake of argument, Benchmade has their custom shop, right? So
Yeah.
I can go on there and I can pick my blade steel and my handle color and my hardware. I can even, have custom laser etching so that it really is a one-off. And it's a guy in a shop putting those pieces together. I mean, he's pulling them from parts bins, but still, that you could theoretically end up with a unique combination. And then you add the laser etching. That is custom, right? I would be the only one who had that particular griptilian or whatever, or that particular bug out. But nothing in that process would have been handmade, right? You've got, computer ground blades, and you've got injection molded handles and all this kind of stuff. So nothing's, in that case, everything is customized, but nothing is actually handmade. So I feel like we're getting more into, when we say custom, I think what we really mean is handmade. And there's this romantic idea of a guy in a shop, forging on an old piece of railroad track and that kind of thing, with, pedaling his giant grinding wheel and making that. But that's just not the reality, it's not the reality.
What do you think, Doug?
I think it's a lot about semantics. Custom knife, I think, should by definition mean, it's not like every other knife. So whether that is just a different color handle or a different blade steel, if it's a full design from the customer or from the maker that is more of a one-off, I think that could qualify more as a custom. Then you get into handmade, which is, where the line blurs even more. Handmade, mid-tech, small batch, kind of like the subjects of this conversation. That's where it really gets more messy in my mind. Custom, you have a lot of say in what the end product is like, whereas a handmade or something similar, handmade could be, any tools used in the toolbox to come up with a knife-shaped object in the end, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a custom piece. It is just made, more parts by hand than by a computer process or something along those lines, sending it out.
So, this is a custom maker's website that I'm familiar with here. And, these are like how I classify the three kind of classifications of blades that I make. PG, precision ground. So PG would be like the Minnow and the Mako. Although I did hand grind some Makos, so they would be more like the CU series. But PG series, precision ground, sent out to get ground, sent out to get heat treat, laser blanks come in, get sharpened. In the case of the Minnow, I 3D print the scales. In the case of the Mako, they are G10 and they are machined in Ohio. So, whatever you call your knives, I think the most important thing is to be honest about how they're made. Now, what you want to call how they're made, it's hard to. There's no what's the word? There's no sort of law giving organization that classifies them. In my mind, I make that if it is hand ground on whatever the 2x72 or forged, that is custom to me, because I don't want to put anybody down, but a monkey can do most parts of the process. So, for instance, profiling a blade and this whole conversation around lasering or water jetting and blah blah blah. Dude, you do not. I could take somebody with no previous experience and pretty quickly get them up and running and profiling a blade. Like, you see that line, grind to that line. Like, that's not hard. Even the handles are, once you get the hang of that, that's not a super hard thing. That could be taught pretty quickly. But grinding a blade, especially freehand, you got to mess up some steel for a while before you get that down. That's a pretty high skill job, and then to get it pretty and consistent, that. So to me, that to be a knife maker, you got to be able to do that. And even forging guys usually do some grinding. Some forging guys do a lot of grinding. So that's just a very easy spot to delineate between one and another. And in my case, sole authorship, if all the processes are in house, including the heat treatment, usually, then I feel like everything happened in my shop, and that's sole authorship. I do not make many of those. I'd like to make more. It's actually enjoyable, but the time it takes me to make one of these, I could make 15 of those. And so, yeah, this one's more expensive, but it's not 15 times more expensive, which gets into the next term that is so misused, which is mid-tech. Mid-tech. What is the definition of mid-tech? Because I think mid-tech, the old school guys would say water jetting the profile is a mid-tech now. They would say that, and different people have different definitions. You could call my PG series, where it gets cut out of my shop, heat treated out of my shop, and bevel ground out of my shop. Some guys could call that a mid-tech. Now it comes back, I assemble it and sharpen it. So, that could be considered a mid-tech, because my hands are on it. We also clean up the profile. That's another thing we do in-house. So what is a mid-tech? What do you think is a mid-tech? Does the PG series qualify as a mid-tech? Go ahead, Paul. What do you think?
In my head, when I think mid-tech, I think something like, I don't know, something almost like a Sebenza. I mean, they're a little bit more mass-produced than what most people would call a mid-tech, but this idea where you are using computer-controlled machinery to produce the parts, and mainly what you are doing is assembling parts, right? You're not actually shaping the metal. You're not actually doing really any handwork at all. You're just taking finished parts and putting them together. I don't know that. I mean, the PG series does have handwork involved. Like I have a minnow here in front of me. So like with my very fancy cardboard sheath, but like this minnow, the perimeter of this blade was ground by hand. It was sharpened by hand. The scales are 3D printed. So like, I feel like the PG series is kind of a little bit past what I would call mid-tech. Like, to me, mid-tech is assembling finished parts.
Okay. What do you think, Doug?
I think maybe it is somewhere between a mid-tech and a small batch. where you get a little more of that personal touch. But so many of the processes are out of shop, where you end up with, you receive parts and you're assembling. There is some finish work involved, but a lot of it does take place outside of the shop. So yeah, I could see that as being somewhere in the mid-tech to small batch range, depending how you define each one.
Right. Small batch production, semi-custom. That's a term I've heard people use. And some of these things just, it's just so hard to define. And they're marketing terms. I think more than anything, they're marketing terms. And just explaining how your knife is made and being honest about it. But, it's interesting. There are some companies out there that do not want you to know how, where, or who is making their knives. For instance, like a company like White River Knife and Tool, or a company like Larkin Precision Grinding, who's also Brad Larkin is that company, and Bradford Knives is from there. But Brad grinds knives. He's a big facility. He grinds a lot of people's knives. And some people will take knives that he's ground for them and say, hey, well, yeah, this is a custom knife. I hand ground it. And it's not. And some people have gotten busted for that. Just like people, would have knives made in China and be like, oh, yeah, this is custom in-house. So the use of CNC, that's an interesting conversation too. And this other podcast, and this what piqued my interest, this other podcast talked about the use of CNC in a way that it was sort of less than or not really knife making. And I'm thinking to myself, it takes a while to learn how to grind a knife. It takes a while to, put that blade to the grinder and be able to get an even plunge and, hold it there steady and not burn the tip, or, all these kinds of, it does take some time, but it's not rocket science per se. You know what is rocket science? Learning how to use 3D CAD software. You know what else is rocket science? Figuring out how to use CAD CAM software to write the program for the machine and then running the machine. And one of the interesting things that they were talking about on that podcast was they were like just talking about the guy running the machine. Well, that's the final step in the process. And you like the fixturing. So not only do you have to design, the tool paths and all that, you got to design the fixturing to hold it there. So I'm not saying one is better or worse, but it takes a lot of skills. Unless you're sending it out and having somebody else do it. If you're doing it in-house, it takes a lot of skills to make a knife with CNC. And one of the things that you had mentioned, Chris Reeve knives, one of the things they do is they grind their bevels on a mill, which they don't send it to Larkin or use. A burger grinder is the tool that's most commonly used. Like Benchmade has burger grinders, Spyderco has burger grinders. They might even have, I think Benchmade also has Siepmann grinders, which is another company, but they've gone out of business. Or at least the grinder portion did. They still make the wheels. I don't know. But all that to say, that's not a less than skill set. That is not a quick to develop skill set. That is a hard skill set to be able to operate a CNC, do it well, and you can mess stuff up. You can mess the equipment up. The stakes are higher. And just to have a CNC, you need 3-phase power. You need a really significant air compressor. You need lots of dryers and stuff for that air. Like it's really significant to set one of those up. So all that to say, so what I wanted to do was take a look at a few different companies here, so to classify them. So here's a fella. He was at the Lehigh Valley Knife Show that just happened this weekend, and I would say he is very much a custom maker. Like this knife here. He's a really good knife maker, but
Would you mind sharing his screen?
Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you for reminding me. Boom. I'm looking at it, but you couldn't see it. Imagine that.
Thank you.
So, so this knife here. I mean, this is a lot of work. Those of you who know how to make knives can look at that and be like, "That's a lot of." I mean, that sheath with that bent metal. That's probably nickel. I mean, like nickel silver or something. I don't know. Polished edge. I mean, like a lot of his stuff is just like that. Like, let's go to some of the other ones. Or something like this. You know, with a Hamon and a lot of different styles. He or even something like that. Now, granted, I don't know that anybody. Well, somebody might have commissioned the knives, but you know, these are what I think of when I think of custom knives. Is that what you think of?
Robert makes excellent cutting tools that are absolutely gorgeous. Yeah.
I think for me, you know, just thinking about some of the knives I saw on Saturday and the different craftsmen, part of what I admire is the skill that goes in, right? So like the first knife and sheath that you showed, Gary, like there are so many different skill sets that went into making that. You know, the leather work, different kinds of metal work, forging, grinding, you know, all kinds of stuff went into that. But I also saw some other knives that, like, for instance, Brian Nadeau had a bunch of knives at his table, right? And I had not handled any of his knives in person. And I got to flip the double-edged flipper. I cannot remember the name of it right now. But, like, I know that a lot of that knife was made, you know, by CNC. But I also know enough about Brian's story that, I mean, the years of effort and education that went into him developing his skill to be able to do those things on a CNC, that's also admirable. So he's using different tools, but he's demonstrating mastery of his craft, right? So you might have an ABS bladesmith, like one of the guys that had, like, you know, they made their own Damascus and had an integral bolster on a kitchen knife, right? Like, or there was another ABS journeyman smith who had his test knife on his table that was bent, you know, where he forged this knife, he cut through the hemp rope, he shaved, he bent it to 90 degrees, he did all the things. So they have both demonstrated mastery of their craft, but they are different crafts.
Yeah, they are. And one's not better or worse than the other. Yeah, I was looking for pictures for
Grimsmo is a great example. You know, if you follow their YouTube channel, you see how much waste is created and how many times he's crashed his mill trying to figure out how to make these parts. And there is a significant time investment and skill investment in that, not unlike learning how to forge.
He just started on a Tormach and worked his way up, and now he's got really high-end mills, a lot of demand, and a different approach. But I mean, I consider this a custom. I mean, I don't know if you consider his shop a factory. I mean, it's low enough volume that they're not, you know, they're pretty much almost exclusively selling straight to customers. You know,
yeah, but here's a question: if John Grimsmo makes, you know, five Norsemen, I guess Norsemen, yeah, 5 Norsemen, and he doesn't number them, could you tell them apart? I mean, they would pretty much be identical, right? If they weren't numbered. If he didn't number the blade and the handle to match, you could take.
That's just part of CNC. I mean, that's repeatability is part of the new world order of tools that you have in your knife shop now.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Handmade, custom. When you're talking about true one-off, unique, you know, if you're taking somebody who's hand grinding blades, even if they're using a template for their profile, there are going to be minor differences from blade to blade, and so each of those really is a unique work. Even if you took somebody top of their game and asked them to make two knives with the same materials, they're going to be a little bit different. And that uniqueness is maybe what we're getting at when we're talking custom.
Well, and here is a question: does the average person buying a custom knife, do they care whether it was water jetted? Do they care if a CNC did some work to it? Well, I mean, technically a water jet or a laser is a form of CNC, computer numeric control. So, like, how much of that do people care about? And here's my sort of my take on it. There is a segment of the knife collecting world who cares about that, but that segment of the knife making world does not care about these kinds of knives. They don't care about that for these kinds of knives. They care about it for these kinds of knives.
But do they care about it because they actually care, or do they care about it because of what it does to the value of the knife? Like when we were talking about watches the other day, Gary, right? And like you can spend multiple thousands of dollars on a mechanical watch that is not as accurate as a $20 Timex from Walmart. So like, are you trying to get a timepiece that keeps the best time? Or are you trying to virtue signal that you possess something that is very valuable and hard to get, right? Like if you walk into a room with a Rolex, in most rooms, there aren't going to be many other people who have those. If you walk into a knife show with, the knife that you have on the screen, nobody else is going to have that. Now, if I walk into a knife show with a Norseman, there's a good chance, at Lehigh Valley, there were probably a couple other people with a Norseman in their pocket. Is that what we're talking about? The exclusivity of an item and how that brings about, perceived value that maybe is beyond any kind of practical measure?
I was at the Texas Blade Show, and the guy next to me, I think his name was Dave. I think everybody seemed to know him. I hadn't heard of them, but a lot of other famous, especially forging guys, like the Forge and Fire guys, were over there, and Melissa Backwoods knew him, and like all these sort of knife celebrity people kind of knew him. I didn't know him from Adam. He's just the dude next to me, and he's a forging guy, and he probably only had about 5 or 6 knives on his table, one of which was $7,000. And there was a very specific demographic of people that came and looked at that knife. And that were, well, firstly, there's a very specific demographic that can afford a $7,000 knife. It was a huge Bowie knife, too. Like, it wasn't a practical knife to use. It was a sort of a showpiece. And so, but if you take, like, the Lehigh Valley Knife Show, a Norseman's going to create more interest from a particular demographic than another demographic. So, the knife world, so you got your fixed blade, old school forging, or even this isn't forged. Well, I'm pretty sure it's not forged. It's stock removal. But,
Robert does forge if this is still his site.
Oh, does he?
Yep.
Well, if he did forge one, this might have been forged because it's a Skagel, and Skagel's a forged knife, and pushing, but it may not be. I'm not sure. But be that as it may, there's particular people who want fancy fixed blades like that, and that's a particular group of people. And then there's the slip joint guys that come, and like I saw one guy from the show. He's like, "Here's my haul." They were all slip joints. And so, everybody has their, particular thing. I think more broadly, especially on the interwebs and whatnot, something like a Norseman has a pretty wide appeal. Now, here's an interesting company, Montana Knife Company. So these guys are about 4 years old or so, And watching their videos and just sort of doing the math, they're putting out, I don't know, 100,000 blades a year, maybe more. And they just blew up. What's interesting to me about these guys is they're building a knife kind of like my PG series. Not only is it kind of like my PG series, it's actually very much like my PG series. You know, it's being ground probably by Larkin. The same CNC guy is doing the G10 scales. I'm just about certain because you know, when you make these things, you can recognize work, and I recognize that work as his. So, and their knives are, you know, not inexpensive. I mean, there's a paring knife for $350, which is a Larkin ground, you know, G10 scales. Yeah. So, what kind? You know, what would you call this? Is this a factory knife? This is a, you know, this is a model. Their model is a model a lot of people are doing, sending out to be ground, getting the scales done somewhere, assembling them, you know, doing some odds and ends in their own shop. It's kind of like what I'm doing. I mean, is that a mid-tack? Is that a factory knife? Is that a small batch? Although if you're doing 100,000 of them a year, that's not necessarily a small batch, even spread across a few models. So that's, I guess that's almost a production knife, although it's made the exact same way as something I would call a mid-tech for me. So that it gets confusing, but I think the moral of the story is tell the truth. Tell the truth. How did you make the knife? And as long as you're transparent about that, you can call it mid-tech, you can call it custom, you can call it whatever you want, because those terms they mean different things. Even amongst us three, they mean different things to different people. And so I think it's just the important part is to be honest about how you make it, and don't get hung up on is it custom, mid-tech, handmade, small batch, you know, large batch. And at the end of the day, I rarely have customers ask me that. How was it made? Even though it's on my site, you know, like maybe they looked, but you know, people ask you questions that you answer on your website all the time. So that's, you know, that's just not something that comes up. There is a segment that cares, but most people don't. And so, like for instance, the Folklore, the Omnivore, the 6-inch chef's knife, the Beast, the Folklore Beast, those are all hand ground.
Backcountry, the Patrol.
The Backcountry, the Patrol, yeah, a lot. There's a number of mine that are hand ground. So if you want that, I hand ground a couple of Makos in the new Magnamax steel, Laren's next steel in the lineup, which I only have a few of, and I don't know when the next batch is coming, because now that CPM is out of business, that could have been another podcast. That could have been another podcast topic, with CPM being out of business, and now tariffs going up, and you know, sourcing steel is all of a sudden going to be potentially a problem. And
I will,
you know, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, Ben Peterson just posted a video a couple days ago where he kind of talked about the tariffs and manufacturing and all that, and he went into some pretty clear detail about where they're making some of their knives and why they're making the choices they're making, and the question of just make it in the US. So I'd say for anybody listening to this who's interested, that's a very informative video.
Yeah, I just wonder. And here's the crazy thing with the tariff: 145% on Chinese stuff. A number of the other things were paused, but 145% on Chinese stuff. So if you ordered, you know, these batches, when guys make them, you know, it's tens of thousands of dollars. They're ordering them months in advance. So they're on the slow boat from China, maybe, or airmail, one of the two. But if you ordered it and it was on its way over here, and you expected, you know, whatever 10% or whatever that tariff was before, and now your knives. So if you had a knife that was going to retail for say $300, let's say your landed cost was going to be $150. Now your landed cost is $400, and you would have to sell it at a minimum at $600, maybe $700. So your $300 knife is now. So, yeah,
Or
I
imagine you did
wonder.
a Kickstarter,
Yeah,
right? And
yeah.
you took money assuming that you were going to have a certain cost. You've accepted the money. You've ordered the blades or whatever's coming from China, and now what do you do?
It's I thought very carefully and very seriously about making some models in China. It's real. You can really get inexpensive work done there, and you can get good work done there too. But I decided not to and just keep everything domestic. And man, am I glad I did. So, because I may have some price increases, to some of my materials and some of my inputs, but it's not going to be, it's not going to be super dramatic. It's just going to be a little bit. And one of the things, speaking of custom, vertical integration and doing things in house, I think has a sort of charm of its own. And so, going to 3D printed scales, I'm really curious. Here's
Why don't you switch screens to show which is biggest?
Oh, yeah. I can do that.
While he's playing, here's what it looks like on a knife.
Let's see. Let's get rid of. Oh. I have a huge screen, so like when I move my mouse, it takes me a while to find where it is. Yeah, that's a better. Here's a set. They're sort of topographic because of the way they're printed. They're carbon fiber infused. I know that G10, well, like in Doug's phone there, that's a 3D printed one. I know that there are higher end. I know there are higher end materials, but this is more durable than wood. Maybe a little less durable than G10, but it allows me to get to a price point and offer more knife for the money. And so I'm not, I'm not trying to get the fancy knife crowd. They can buy other people's knives that, are in a different price category, a different purpose. To me, I'm sad if somebody buys my knife and doesn't use it. Like, I want them to buy the knife. I want them to cut stuff with the knife. I want it to perform for them, to exceed their expectations in terms of the way that it will perform with geometry, heat treat, design, all those things. It's funny, like burl handles. Burls are nothing but trouble. They're like a part of the tree that had issues, and so when you're working with them, pieces will chip off, and it's not like straight grain wood is much stronger. Obviously, burl looks so nice, and we like it for that. But in terms of a durable handle material, it's terrible.
But it also demonstrates your mastery as a craftsman when you can use it. Like on the Mark of the Maker podcast, they say all the time, you don't buy the knife, you buy the maker. Like when I bought my first Mako, it wasn't that I wanted a knife to cut stuff, right? It was that I had met you and you were the guy on Blade Forums with the steel charts, and you were trying stuff with Rex 121 that nobody else was trying. I wasn't just trying to get a knife. I was purchasing a part of that story so that I could be a part of it. And when you get into, even in production knives, right? Like when I buy a Spyderco knife, I'm buying part of that story. I think of like the videos I've seen of like Sal Glesser talking about starting the company in the bread truck, or I think of all the videos, like I was just watching some Blade Show videos from last year where Eric Glesser was doing interviews and talking about all the blades that he likes. And, when I buy a Spyderco knife, I'm buying that story. And I think that's why some knives are not worth as much. If I were to buy like a Civivi knife, that company doesn't have a face to me, and they're putting out so many models. I mean, they make great knives. Like, I have an Elemental, and it's an awesome knife, especially for the price. But it doesn't mean the same kind of thing. Yeah, it doesn't mean the same kind of thing to me as, well, like this little guy, right? There's a custom, right?
That
Honestly,
is a custom
this
eye.
knife means more to me than probably any other knife I own, right? Because I know that this is the only knife like this. I know that this blade cracked when Gary was straightening it with his own hand. I know it sat in his shop for God knows how long and got the fancy gunmetal finish in the corner, right? And that this is the only one quite like this. So, like, I'm not saying it's, a jewel encrusted Michael Walker zipper blade or whatever, but, this means something. This means something. And maybe that's really what the issue is, right? That when I know somebody put their hands on something, that time conveys value and meaning,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in the case of, say, like Montana, part of what they've done well is tell a story via marketing and, having a lot of other people also relay that story. And other guys, like take, for instance, Loveless, going back even a little further. He was a character. He went to Blade Show. I think he barked at people sometimes, not like literally bark like a dog, but like he would, have things to say. And so, yeah, you're buying the story. You're buying into the person. You're buying into the narrative. And so, yeah, that's a lot of it. That's a lot of the story.
Yeah.
But you gotta,
or Cold Steel, right? Like, do you really think Cold Steel could have been the company that it is if it weren't for Lynn Thompson? I mean, love him or hate him, that guy, he was a character, When you see a video of the guy walking through Blade Show with an Espada XL in both pockets, like, that means something,
right?
And
right.
and that's different than, like, I remember not that long ago when we had a lot of these Chinese OEM manufacturers switch over to their own brands, and we had, Kaiser and Reich and Riot and and all these companies kind of bust on the scene. If you're just looking for technical prowess, you can you really beat WE knives for technical prowess, right? Like, their stuff, they are very, very technically proficient. But the only knives they make that really seem to mean something to me are the ones that are connected to a maker, right? Like, because Elijah Isham designed it, and I listened to him talk about it on a podcast and watch videos of him playing with it, right? So, like, if you don't connect to that meaning, it's really hard. It's really hard to make something of value in the knife world, I think. I mean, you're always going to have the collectors who are just, scalping blades and trying to get the sprint runs and resell them and all that. But I mean, for like the people who are really in the hobby, it's got to mean something.
Well, take buck knives, for instance. I mean, buck knives, the original guy who started it was a pastor. And from what I understand, I think he even started initially making knives in the basement of a church. So, and it grew from a family business. I think it still is actually a family business, but it grew from a very modest business to, a really significant knife company. And so, like, that's a story. Case knives is a story. And so I just wonder if 50 years from now or 80 years from now, there's going to be people collecting Civivi Elementums. I don't know that that's going to be the case.
But, right. But, like, do you remember when Buck came out with the 70 series for their slip joints, where they had the Chinese made knives that were being sold in, like, Walmart? So, like, you could get the 303 that was made in Idaho, or the 373 that was made in China.
Right. Yeah.
Remember that? So, like, a big part of their mythos was that it was Idaho made, it was American tough, right? And then they started doing all this manufacturing in China to compete by price, and it kind of hurt their image a little bit. And then they had this whole big PR campaign before COVID about how they were moving all of their production back to the US, and they would only make Buck knives in the United States because they were a US brand. And now, quietly, a few years later, they're rolling out a bunch of knives from China again. And that does affect the image of a company. And I mean, how many trademarks have we seen, like Camelus or Schrade, where they had this really deep meaning in the knife world because they were made, like Camelus, like they were made in New York, and you know, a guy just like your neighbor or you could have been the guy who made it, and so it meant something. And then it gets bought up by one of these mega corporations, who's like the company that bought Cold Steel, and it
Didn't
doesn't
they buy
mean
another
something.
company too? That company?
Yeah, they've purchased several, and I don't know, man. Like, I know I keep harping on this, but for me, the knives that, to go old school Wrangler Star and say the knives that give me the fizz, right? They're not just the knives that cut the best. They're the knives that connect to me on an emotional level. Like, I can buy 100 Moras, and they're not going to mean the same thing to me as I have a pen knife from Sears that was the first knife I ever owned that my sister bought me for my 8th birthday. And price-wise, they're worth the same. But man, that knife, it means something, My sister bought it for me because it one my grandfather carried. His was a Craftsman, and they stopped making the Craftsman knives at that point, but it still said Sears on it. And so, like, that knife means so much to me. And even, I know I'm kind of teasing a little bit, but like this knife, like, this means something to me, right? My friend made this knife, and I can't get that at Walmart. I can't get that at Knife Center. You just can't do that.
Well, you might be able to get it at Knife Center.
Not this one. Oh, you're going to. We have to name this. I think it should be Abomination. What do you think? The Creely Blades Abomination? The Creely Blades Reject? Creely's Rejects? Yeah.
I think it's a short flight. Creely Blades flight, because it had a short flight across the shop.
Yeah, it did. I have argued that the Mako and the Minnow need a sibling called the Mud Skipper. Gary doesn't seem to think that that's a very good name for a knife. But
Mud Skipper.
I wanted the Minnow to be named the Mud Skipper.
Oh, really?
You don't remember that?
Vaguely.
Yeah, when you were trying to name the Minnow, and I was like,
although I think the Omnivore is from you.
Yeah, I think that I was involved in that conversation at least.
Yeah. So the Omnivore, the Omnivore worked out. So,
but even that, my Omnivore, it's in 52-100, right? So I don't have the fancy MagnaCut one, but like, arguably, there are a lot of knives that can function as well as that knife, right? There are, a million thinly ground knives that are in better steels, but that knife, that has meaning for me.
And 52-100 is a cool steel. I mean,
and it's got a great patina. It's building a great patina, but yeah,
it's heat treated. Well, it's interesting how that's still a functional knife.
It's a beautifully functional, but the meaning doesn't just come from the function, right? So you can get the mid-tech, you can get the factory-made knife. It's just, I don't know, it's not the same.
So there's a way to combine what you're talking about. If you do have a sentimental streak, that you have, a handmade Spyderco. This is not a handmade Spyderco. This is a Spyderco that I got in 2007. It's a military, and it's been sharpened so much that I had to regrind the faces. So the logo is no longer there, except the company name and blade steel and USA Earth.
I could put the logo back on it for you.
No, it's okay. But like you said, the knives you spend more time with, the knives you spend more time on maintaining, they can develop more of a emotional attachment beyond just, I got this cool button lock from Frank, and that has its certain appeal, but I don't know that I will ever use this in the way that I would use that Spyderco that I reground the blade on.
Yeah, this is filthy right now, but this is a Pakistan Rainbow Barlow that I believe came from Knife Center. It was like a $5 Father's Day sale or something that my kids picked, right? No, this is the first knife that my kids picked for me. And so I don't want to think about how many thousands of dollars worth of knives in my collection. But honestly, this is in my pocket every single day because my kids gave it to me. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, Doug. Like the sentiment of how you get a knife or things you have done with a knife, like
Now, one of the things with that, though, is this whole conversation around, like, how was it made? And was it made in somebody's shop? And was it handled by the craftsman? I think that starts you off on the foot of, already starting to have a connection with it right out of the gate as a new product. If you've met the maker at a knife show, and more, the longer I'm in this, the more and more makers I meet all the time. And so, like I have a number of Protects. I know I talked to the owner of Protect many, many times, and he doesn't invite me over for dinner. That's partly because he's in California, I think. But but I know who he is. He recognizes me. I recognize him. So I think aluminum's an underused material. So so there's a connection there to that company. There's a connection to that maker, and so yeah.
And have you ever had a knife where it meant a lot to you, and then maybe the maker said or did something that was a little? I don't know if we want to call anybody out on this recording right now, but like the knife that Doug and I were looking at when we were at your shop last week, objectively, it's a wonderful knife, but because of who made it and some of the business practices and the way things went down.
Oh, Survive. Yeah, you can say Survive.
Okay, yeah. So like that Survive knife, handling that knife, which apparently not many people have handled Survive knives.
No, they've paid for them, but not handled them.
That is an objectively very well designed and well made knife. Like handling it is a nice knife. But I've never seen you use it or carry it. It's sitting on your shelf. And because of all the hubbub around what happened with that company, that's
because I make a better knife. I carry my own.
Yeah. You know what? You're fibbing on that one because you carry a lot of knives.
That's true.
And they're not all yours.
They're mostly not mine, actually.
But your kitchen is full of your knives. But yeah, I don't know. Isn't that really what this is all about? What any hobby is about? I guess at its core, we're chasing dopamine, right? But like, we want to feel connected to something, and we like shiny things. Whether it's a well-napped piece of flint that a caveman carries around, or what we have. It's like we want to be connected to something that is special and is unique. We want some exclusivity, right? Of course, among the hobbyists, Spyderco knives are everywhere. But when you're walking in a group of guys and, everybody's got, gas station knives and you've got your Spyderco, you feel like you got something special, right? Or even the fact that I don't even know how many natives I have, but this Maximet, it's a special native, right? So whether it's a watch or a knife or a gun or a belt buckle or whatever, cars, we're trying to take our consumer culture and connect it to something that has meaning, right? Isn't that what we're doing?
Yeah, and I think we're in an era where we're more attracted to more bespoke products. Whether it's a knife, I just learned of there's a Lancaster, Pennsylvania skillet company that's making cast iron in Lancaster County, and they have a Dutch oven. It's $300, but it says made in Pennsylvania, so that interests me. So I may be an owner of such a Dutch oven here at some point. So
now, the cold-hearted bastard in me, though, thinks some of this idea of the bespoke product, in a way, that is a marketing ploy. Like, do you remember when Blade HQ did all of those maker tour videos where they would go to people's shops? Like, they went out to Grant and Gavin Hawk, and they visited Tony Bowes, and they did all those videos. You know,
vaguely,
yes, they are letting us get a peek behind the curtain and meet famous people, but also, I watched that video. Now I really want to buy one of those knives, right? Now I really want a Hawk Lock or a Mud, or I really want, I can't afford the Tony Bowes custom, but I can get the case Tony Bowes pattern, right? So I do feel a little bit icky, because I think on some levels this is being used to manipulate us to make a profit. And where do we draw that line, right?
Well, as long as it is in fact bespoke, I'm fine with that. What I don't like is when it's, pretend bespoke.
Like, what was the knife that Pete, the kitchen knife from Instagram that had the hole in it? I can't remember the company. Pete from Cedric and Ada. The Husk, yeah.
Husk.
Like how they say it's handmade in Japan and
that, yes.
Right, and then you get it and it's none of those things. Yeah.
So the whole reason I started making knives, I'm just looking up a video here, when I did.
It's because you couldn't afford the knives you wanted?
Well, there was this company, and I think he still makes knives, but Cut Brooklyn. And so I saw this video and I was like, man, I really want one of these knives. And at the time, for a bigger chef's knife, and they were only an ABL, but at the time they were like $500 or something. And I was like, that's preposterous. I'll never pay $500 for for a custom chef's knife. And so now I'm like, that's not too bad. But I watched this guy's videos, and like, I wanted the knife, and it was just so much. I thought it was so much. And then I ended up, thousands of dollars of equipment later, starting to make my own. Of course, I didn't realize the hardest knife to grind is a chef's knife. Like, I started out with a knife that tall that turned into like, a breaking knife by the time I was done.
And that's how the Omnivore was made.
No, that's not how the Omnivore was made. But they're hard to, it's a hard grind to do. But yeah, but it's about story, and it's about, it's about the connection that you have to the brand, whether you actually know. Like, one of the comments was, a lot of people don't have the opportunity to meet those people. So for instance, I bought this is a great example. I bought a minimalist from Alan Foltz. Now you can get a minimalist for like $20. But I bought one from Alan Foltz for $250 in MagnaCut. It looked very much like the one from China for $20. But this was a custom one, and I bought it from him personally. And I was willing to pay that much more for essentially, well, I wouldn't say essentially same knife, because MagnaCut's going to hold an edge way better than like the 3R13, whatever that is, that they use. So, yeah.
Like your Beast. The Beast makes me think of that too, right? Like, you sitting around thinking, well, Joe X says he can break any knife, but I bet I can make a knife he can't break. And then he can't break it, and he ends up shooting it twice, right? So, like, arguably, is the Beast the best bushcraft knife for bushcraft? I don't know. But man, it's got it. Like honestly, I'd argue that the classic is probably a better bushcraft knife than the
Oh yeah,
Beast.
that's what I'd buy.
Right? If you actually want to do bushcraft, but that has a story, right? This guy who breaks all these knives couldn't break this knife, and some dude in Pennsylvania made this knife, and now I can get one. And he heat treated it in his own shop. You know, he's got the burns on his arms to prove it, and like that is really cool. So that's you know, a Mora Garberg is probably going to process wood better than your Beast, right? If I'm just trying to make
about that.
Well, okay, but you get what I'm saying, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, the story behind the Beast is much more what you're buying than a knife that can process wood.
And strangely, that's become, well, I mean, that may change at some point, but that has been the best-selling knife I make for
because of the story, man. Because of the story.
The DBK video didn't hurt either.
Like, think about, I remember on Blade Forums when somebody posted one of the SE knives that took a bullet, right? And like, you could not, like, they blew out of stock everywhere, right? Because this is the same knife that saved somebody's life, right?
Yeah, it's the story. Well, gents, we've been on here for about an hour, and I think we've pretty much covered this particular topic pretty well. And I think it's an important conversation to have. And knives do mean more than just what they are. How they're made matters. Who made them matters. The story matters. It all matters. And the most important thing is that all of that is true and there's integrity to it. That, you know, people actually, the things are what people say that they are. And there's unfortunately been some times in the industry when that's not always the case. But yeah, I think it's just important to be honest about how you go about making and what in fact it is. But you had your Mary Carter there.
I did. Yes.
Doug was a big Mary Carter. I think he still is, but Murray Carter. I would say Mary like Mother Mary. It's Murray. Yeah. And like even that one that you made is influenced by
heavily, by a number of knives from my using past.
Yep. Cool. Well, hey, thank you to everybody that that tuned in, and I think this will be available on my YouTube channel and Instagram. But it's the first time I'm using this service, so that's really up in the air. I don't actually know, and I could put some pleasant music on the background here as we get ready to head out. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next one.